Namaste and greetings. I, Shweta Shankar, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI Web Policy Learning. Today we are gathered here for day 7 of UPLGYF, Urban Policy and Local Governance Youth Fellowship, an online national autumn and winter school program, a 4-month online immersive introductory leadership certificate training fellowship program organized by IMPRI Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies, IMPRI Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. The chair for the program is Professor Manjuli Bharathi ji, professor at the Center for Urban Policy and Governance, School of Habitat Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and a visiting professor at IMPRI. The conveners for this course are Dr. Soumyatik Chattopadhyay ji, Mr. Tikender Singh Panwar, Mr. Sameer Unhale, Mr. Aravind Unni, Dr. Simi Mehta, and Dr. Rajan Kumar. We have also shared the course outline and reading resources document in your email for your kind attention. We will be providing videos of each session for flexible learning at your place and convenient time. Before we start today's session, I would like to announce the housekeeping rules. First, it is encouraged that you join the meeting on time. There will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Share your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise and refrain from making general comments in the question to save time. Without any further delay, to begin today's session, I would like to invite our chair, Professor Manjula Bharathi ji, for her remarks about this extensive course. Welcome, ma'am, and over to you.
Thank you, IMPRI. Thank you so much. Welcome to another interesting and enriching session of urban policy, local governance, initiated by IMPRI. And till now, we have very interesting session that spoke about the ways in which urban governance need to be reimagined, both on ideologically, philosophically, financially. And then also we had sessions to discuss about, how to understand the marginality, how to understand the district planning, how to understand the water governance. So today, we will be discussing on one of the most important issues, urban governance, that is housing. And we are very fortunate to have one of the leading person in urban housing, Dr. Amita Bhide. And and she's my colleague working in the School of Habitat Studies. And her experience and expertise in the area, both theoretically as well as the way in which she's engaging with multitudes of projects dealing with the urban housing, and then her engagement with the government officials and officers, and then the NGOs, and then different groups working in this sector gives her both a theoretical and an empirical advantages and understanding about this issue, where in this the students are working on so it is important. Please take advantage of the session and then take care of the session, and then please use your time to ask questions to Professor Bhide, and then understand this issue, because urban housing, he says that, okay, now have to understand the urban housing with respect to the local governance, and what are the kind of issues and what are the challenges, especially with respect to the marginalized communities. We kept on discussing about the ways in which the marginalized communities, vulnerabilities, and how the urban issues are affecting their day-to-day life, everyday life, the right to the cities, and then urban housing and the basic communities that is needed to the urban housing is very important. And today's session is very important to understand it from a theoretical perspective, and then the urbanization and the uneven development and how the housing issues has been kind of exasperated, and trying to look at the challenges and what local governance can do in this perspective is very important. So I welcome Dr. Bhide to have a lecture, and we're waiting for the lecture. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Manjula. Thank you also, IMPRI, for giving this opportunity. I'm going to share a presentation with, shall I? I'll go to the share button.
Yes, ma'am.
not seeing the share button.
Is it the same? Yeah, okay.
Is this visible now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I'll begin with the introduction that Professor Manjula gave on the topic itself and the importance of housing really as one of the most substantive, most visible issues that we see in our not just large cities, metropolis, but also in the smaller towns, something which is emerging as a very, very large issue and something which has also become politically very salient and significant, especially since 2000 and the passing of the millennium. So it is an important issue. But on the other hand, when we begin to link urban local governance and housing, it raises really a hornet's nest. Urban local governance, we mean institutions which may be highly localized, largely the municipal institutions, but sometimes we also have special townships and industrial townships. So all of that constitutes urban local governance institutions. And do these local governance institutions really have a role to play in housing? So we are going to deal with some of the complicated questions linked to that. So I'm going to talk both. First, begin with housing, and then we'll talk about the relationship with urban local governance. So, I'm going to get into a little bit of world history. So historically, really, housing as a question emerged in the throes of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. How did it emerge as a question? Basically because till then, housing was something which was a self-provided good. Just as animals provide for their own housing in their forest or in the caves, or birds provide for their own housing through nests and tree hollows, etc. Human beings also provided for their own housing as per the local materials available, local skill sets available. So perhaps materials which are left over after cropping, local soil, bricks made out of that local rock and soil, roofs which are made from thatch, and construction, which is also dependent on the skill, on the needs. So housing was never really a question. But what happened during Industrial Revolution was basically a lot of migration in cities. And in cities where the densities were already high, large amounts of population, constraints of land, and the structures were built formally. And which is why you got into all kinds of transactions like leasing, like tenement housing, and so or sometimes housing which was provided by the employers themselves, extremely bad living conditions, and perhaps very few ways in which people commanded their own housing on whatever kind of lands that they got hold of. And which is how housing emerged as a question. There is a very, very interesting essay written by Friedrich Engels, Marx's co-author in many of his writing, which talks about the housing question. And this essay really puts housing as a part and places housing as a part of the overall relationships which emerged in the context of the Industrial Revolution and one of the ways in which the bourgeoisie really exploited the workers. So part of the entire labor conflict. But at the same time, you see that the living conditions of workers provoked significant debate. Because besides leftist Marxist thinkers, there were also a lot of humanist thinkers who believed that the city should do philanthropically, they should do something for the workers. So this included people like Proudhon, This included people and many of the city thinkers in places like Vienna, also in Berlin. And they began to experiment with what can be done about the improvement of the working conditions of the house. They also started imploring the local state, the city governments to do something about it. And that is how then in later years, housing also became a question which city governments dealt with. So Vienna, London, Manchester, all of these cities developed new and new concepts like public housing, social housing, and creating many different models of public action. This was also in some ways encouraged by the fact that in the period during the First World War and the Second World War, these were also uh, incidents and events of mass destruction, and a lot of existing housing in these cities was destroyed. Not just that, but so housing became a much more widespread problem than just the workers and people who were homeless. It also became a problem which affected the general population. But besides that, there was also this entire plea that there are so many war widows and families of soldiers who were fighting these wars for their country, and therefore the city and the country also owes something to them. So that was the other propelling factor for the development of these concepts like public housing, social housing, and so on and so forth. Slight differences between public housing and social housing, and let me explain that. Public housing means housing for any of the, I would say, a focus on weaker sections and workers, but also other people, including lower middle class and so on and so forth. But this is housing which is constructed by the state, by the government. Social housing means especially housing for weaker sections. Okay? So both of these were really extremely popular concepts. So this is how it began, that both the housing question as well as actions towards housing, which were largely initiated by city governments and then subsequently supported by the national governments in cities like Vienna, London, Manchester, which were the sites of industrial revolution. So now, when we understand housing, there is a sea change in the contemporary situation. For one, today, housing is not being considered only as a basic needs. So we always say roti, kapda, makan, and sometimes equate housing with both roti and kapda as basic as that for survival. It is. And that basic need part of housing, nobody can deny. So there is a shelter component, which is very, very critical. But besides that, what is impacting really the public provisioning systems of housing is also that housing is being now considered an asset. So when you begin to create an asset inventory for yourself, housing, the number of houses you have, a second home, a third home, a home in, let's say, the places which are like hill stations or slightly away. So those kind of things are becoming very important. Not just that, but it is also becoming the basis for investment. So today there are housing price indexes, property indexes, which are global, and where people often invest in housing for returns. You will see that as a basic feature, which is there in several advertisements of housing projects, that there are actually developers who also provide for returns, assured returns from the investment that people can undertake. So all of these are like conflicting pressures on housing. The same or similar kind of products is also for shelter. It's also for assets which can be passed on, so inheritance, and also a basis for financial transactions, financial markets to run themselves in the form of investment. And the conflict between all of these is really something which is critical and creating a lot of paradoxes in today's situation. So we may have empty houses or vacant houses on one hand, and at the same time, we may have several thousand people who are also homeless. So these are really the contemporary paradoxes. The second thing, I think housing as a process began as a people-led, people-constructed, financed, and resulting in the formulation of a place with cultural and local variations. So if I know many of you are young people, you may not have studied the geography that I did. But in our geography lessons, we grew up with different climate zones, the kind of housing which was present in the different climate zones within our country as well as globally. So how do the Eskimos live? How do the people who live in grasslands live? And all of their houses, if you will see, the housing is not something which is constructed by the state. It is not constructed by developers, but it is people-led, constructed, and financed as well. So even if there is some amount of money transactions which are involved, often these are through informal sources. In fact, even today in India, there is barely 8% of the housing finance market which is formal. So the rest of the 92% of the housing finance market is really informal transactions which never come onto the scene of financial institutions. Right? So housing is this. It also creates a place, right? And this place making has several cultural and local variations. Okay? So you will see tribal housing in different places as very different from, let's say, more caste-based villages. Occupationally, the kind of houses change. So a potter's house is different from a farmer's house, is different from a carpenter's house. There are also caste-based. Where does one create one's house? Who is entitled to what kind of house? So all of these are the cultural variations, including the kind of injustices which are embedded within all of these systems. But what happens with urbanization? The nature of this activity changes totally. So from auto construct or largely people construction, it moves to builder or developer construct. From self-finance or informal finance, housing is dependent then on institutional finance. None of us can afford to buy a house without taking a bank loan, right? Or a loan from some financial institution. From local materials to more standardized and approved materials. So for example, in tribal areas in Thane, where I have worked for a long time, houses are made from a thin bamboo reed, which is called karvi. Okay? Now suppose you build a house made of karvi and construct it in Mumbai, it will be considered unauthorized because bamboo or karvi or reeds are not considered acceptable materials in an urban setting at all, and they are not approved. Right? So the materials become more standardized: brick, cement, steel, now glass. Right? So, and none of these are really local materials. It is sand, right? But really you move from place to place. And the element of placemaking, right, is, you will see that that gets reduced. Right? So you may often see in villages that people of a community stay together. But you will rarely find that in modern urban construction. Further, this is an activity which is highly regulated. So there are planning regulations, there are building rules, there are land regulations. Plus, there are other regulations. For example, you have to take a EIA permission, okay, for a significantly large construction project. You have to also take permissions from authorities like the airport authority, the local pollution control board, and so on and so forth. So there are a spate of regulations. Mapping how many numbers of permissions are required for housing. In Mumbai, some of the developers have shared with me that there are over 52 different permissions that they require. And this can become such a cumbersome process, which also involves significant amount of rent seeking. It also involves a significant amount of shadow play, and so on and so forth. And the final feature of the contemporary housing situation that I'm going to talk about is that there is an emergent global political economy of housing. The earlier markets were local. So people who are residing in a particular place are working, studying, whatever, in a particular place. Housing market is of that. But now, since it is also seen as an asset or a basis of investment, property markets are also connected globally. So you may have heard of several of our cine stars, etc., having one house in Dubai, one house in London, and so on and so forth. Right? And how are they doing this? Not just because of prestige, but they are seeing the value of these property markets and accordingly investing in some of these. So what are the implications of this kind of a contemporary situation? The first thing I already discussed, which is that today there are extremely diverse needs and demands from housing. Okay? And these are often conflicting. But on the other hand, housing supply is not so flexible. So while there are segmented needs and segmented demands, okay, there are some sections. So one of the largest needs that we have, the shortage of housing, more than it is estimated by the Planning Commission and subsequent task groups which have been put in place by the government, that about 90% of the housing shortage is largely in the lower economic groups and the economically weaker sections. But on the other hand, if you look at the housing supply, it does not cater. 90% housing is not constructed for the lower income groups and the economically weaker sections. So they are just cut out from the entire housing market. And the second part is more and more housing gets created for the upper income segments and for the investment segments. So if you look at, I often give my students an exercise where they are to study housing project ads. And today, every paper will carry, at least newspaper will carry minimally 2 or 3 ads of housing projects. And if you look at the entire, perhaps, branding, mostly foreign names, you will look at the way in which the townships and the building projects are advertised in terms of their location. Near to the metro station, they will not talk of railway station. They will not say near to hospital. If you look at it, epitome of luxury. What you have arrived when you have bought a particular housing project, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the housing supply, there is a complete, what should I say, mismatch between housing demands, or rather housing needs, and housing supply. And that is really the major issue of today. Who intervenes then? Then one of the solutions in this regard, which was formulated in the late 20th century and beginning of end of 19th century, was basically public or social housing. But if you look at the situation of public and social housing, the state institutions which were created to create housing which is affordable, which is social housing, these institutions are now extremely weakened. Because these institutions, in order to even construct housing, they require land, they will require institutional capacity, and they will require financial support. So the institutions are weakened, all housing boards, state housing boards which exist, and therefore the proportion of public or social housing which is created is also very, very low. Today it has reached less than 5% of the overall housing supply, and more than 90% of the housing supply is basically by the private sector. So what is the result? If you look at the situation in cities, there is a rising proportion of those who live in slums or those who live in unauthorized housing. There are cities after cities. I'll just give you a few examples in the surrounding metropolis of Mumbai. A place called Ulhasnagar has got more than 90%, 95% housing, which is unauthorized. And there have been many public interest litigations which have demanded either the regularization, and or the cutting down of all the unauthorized housing. But it just keeps on rising. And this is, Ulhasnagar is not a singular city. There are several cities that see this unauthorized housing, has got multiple terms again which are local, and the number of people who are staying in slums is also increasing. So today, I think the last slum census that we had was along with the census in 2011. And this slum census, for the first time, really counted slums in several tier 2 and tier 3 cities as well. So earlier slums was a phenomenon restricted to the million plus cities. But now it is becoming something which is even entrenched in the smaller towns and cities. The number of homeless population is increasing. And overall, if you see, the affordability, the cost of housing in India is becoming highly unaffordable, even for the middle classes. Inner cities get crowded. And this is really, therefore, a very, very bad situation, a crisis situation almost. We've talked a lot about housing so far, but I want to gradually take you towards housing governance, and then we'll talk about the place of local governance in all of this. So what this chart, which is in front of you showing, it's basically showing you different aspects of what is involved in the construction and the supply of housing, the different kinds of regulating authorities, and which are the responsible institutions. I want all of you, because I'm not going to read this out, I want all of you to take 2 minutes and just see this table. If you have seen this table carefully, one of the things that you will notice is, where does the term urban local government appear? Which is the level at which housing governance happens the most? And you will see largely housing is a state subject, which has and very few dimensions of it. Rather, just the formulation of building controls and some aspect of the development plan again created often by the planning directorate at the state level. So the local governments become the implementing authorities for the development plan. And the building regulations or development control regulations, which are the rules formulated, there is some role played by the municipal institutions. But otherwise, there is hardly any role of the municipal institutions. Housing has largely been a state subject and state regulated, state provided, state controlled subject. After the 1990s, the central government gradually started stepping into the subject of housing more through a liberalization of finance. So even when the central government makes a housing policy, it's more like a guidance note. The other way in which the central government started getting involved in housing is through schemes. So this first occurred in 2005 as a part of JNNURM, in which there was a program called Basic Services for the Urban Poor. And there was also a overall urban improvement program. This was followed by Rajiv Awas Yojana. After the change of government, this was followed by the Pant Pradhan Awas Yojana, which continues till date. So these schemes is something that the central government intervenes in. But local governments, what I have given here, the second slide shows, just to reiterate the point, is basically the 18 functions allotted to urban local bodies by the 74th Constitutional Amendment. Now, mind you, all these 18 functions have also not been completely transferred to the urban local governments, as you may have discussed in perhaps several prior lectures. But I want you to see this from the point of view of, is there housing involved anywhere? So there you will see that there are two direct functions which will impinge on housing. First is urban planning, including town planning. Because town planning will give you the zones which may be used for residential purposes. So it controls the amount of urban land available for construction. The second direct role in relation to housing is regulation of that land use. I talked about implementation of the town plan and construction of buildings. So it's an implementational role. But local governance plays a significant role in the provision of services which will convert mere housing projects into places which are livable. So we have to understand this, that while talking about the urban local governance, the Indian situation is one where cities are far away from urban local governance. Most of the controls are in the hands of state government, followed then by the central government. So this is what I was saying. There are indirect rules and direct rules, which are now being shown with a highlighter. We have already discussed this, so I'm going to move on. Yes. So what is the implication of all this division of functions and what you show? So first, clearly that the cities are the sites of housing issues. And there is a potential that the resolution can be at the city level itself. So a housing solution for Mumbai cannot be a housing solution for Nagpur, or it cannot be a housing solution for Agra. There are very local and site-specific factors. Right? So there are a lot of potentials for city governments to be involved. Okay? But they are not given that role. In our country, no. Instead, what local governments are burdened with is the maintenance of services which are constructed by higher level agencies. So the state housing board will construct houses, and who is providing then the subsequent maintenance of the services like water supply and sanitation, sewage collection, solid waste collection. The same with private housing projects also. Right? You give the permission. No role in the actual construction. And then there are responsibilities on the local government. But local governments can also facilitate a lot of things. For example, if you make changes in the building control rules, where you accept certain building materials. Suppose we say that bamboo houses are permitted. Will it make a lot of difference to the housing situation? It will. Can you allow smaller houses? At one point in time, Delhi had a building control rule where the minimum plot size was 100 square meters. Can we as a developing country afford these kind of large lots? I think today there are many planning laws which then accept larger densities and smaller houses. But that's the way to go. Right? How can we encourage smaller contractors to participate? Because they are really the local housing need providers rather than investment housing need providers. So how can we do that? It's important. Something which is emerging. Many of the schemes like Prime Minister's Awas Yojana keep a role for the city governments, that they have to prepare the city level plans of action. The point is, do urban local governments have the expertise? How many urban local governments have planners? How many of them have well-equipped building control engineers? What is the overall basis of sanctioning plans? Do we have automated systems? Or is this all just discretionary? The second area, which is emergent really for local government, is the creation of shelters for homeless, where urban local governments are expected to create adequate number of shelters for homeless as per the guidelines given by the Supreme Court. But when there is this expectation from urban local governments, the question of whether the municipal governments have adequate land, do they have adequate financial provision for this, is something which remains a question. I'm going to stop here. I know I have raised a lot of complex questions, but we are open to questions. Should I do stop share now, Shweta?
Yes, yes, please.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for shedding light on such an important and complex topic, especially into the implications of urban housing, both in the public and social sectors. To introduce ma'am is the professor and dean of at School of Habitat Studies, Tata Institute.
No longer the dean. Sorry.
Thank you so much. We will now move on to the Q&A session. Yes, Ashish Kalkarji.
Yes, thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful presentation. And there were so many insights that we could really gather. So basically, my topic of presentation in this fellowship is neoliberal policies in housing in India. So that is my topic. And currently, we are seeing this happening in Dharavi, which is redevelopment of Dharavi. So how do you see it, and what kind of perspectives do you have in your mind about redevelopment of Dharavi? Because what I personally see is that there is a lot of disconnect between what is getting implemented and what are the needs of the local people who are residing over there. What does this scheme means to them? So that is a basic question that I would like to put. Yeah.
So the manner and the overall strategy for redevelopment, I have a paper on this, perhaps if you can read, and where I call the slum redevelopment, slum rehabilitation scheme itself as a scheme which comprises multiple violences and exclusions. That is within the nature of the scheme itself. Okay? Having said that, Dharavi raises an even more complex issue. I can give you a complete lecture on Dharavi and go on for 3 hours, 4 hours. But Dharavi is one of the first large slums to emerge in the city. It's now at least the 4th or 5th generation slum. But by that, what I mean is it was somewhere in the 1940s. And even the talk of redevelopment of Dharavi has been going on since 2006. So 2006 to 2024. There are so many transactions and there are so many changes which have happened in Dharavi that the nature of current Dharavi is something which nobody knows. Nobody knows. Not NGOs, not the several political groups who are there. So my sense over there is nobody opposes redevelopment. What is being opposed is the terms of redevelopment. And the terms of redevelopment in Dharavi are going to be very complex. Because who is eligible? Are we going to rehouse the non-eligible, and the way in which they are planning to rehabilitate the non-eligible? Numbers of non-eligible are going to be far more than the eligible. Okay? And the terms of that are not something which can suit the non-eligible tenants at all. What is one going to do about the informal industries? There are 65 very tiny and small industries were there. Some of them are downright, in legal terms, illegal. A lot of processing of waste, etc., etc. And they will not be allowed in residential units. What is one going to do about that? There are large storehouses, godowns, again with chemical storage, posing huge risk to. I mean, if you look at your conventional building rules, it is not just a term of Adani, Ambani, anywhere. Anybody comes, these complexities are going to be there. It is also a place where there are multiple public institutions, because as perhaps the first slum, it has experienced generations of policies and improvement. There are municipal schools, there are ration shops, there are NGOs, there are mandirs, there are Samaj Kendras of different communities. What does one do about that? So I think there are layers and layers and layers and layers. I will just say that.
Thank you, ma'am. I have one more question. I'm doing a primary data collection as well in Dharavi. At least, most probably, I don't know what kind of a situation I'll be having there over there. So I'm planning to stay there for 1 or 2 days if possible. Let me see. I'll figure out with what is happening, because I've already contacted one person who is settled over there, and so basic question that that was emerged out of my research was that what does it mean to the slum dwellers? Because even in 1995, the slum rehabilitation program that took place under Chief Minister Manohar Joshi, at that time buildings were constructed, and all these people got their own flats, and what happened to them? They sold their flats, or they gave it on the rent, and again started living in slums, because to them what it means is just an additional source of income. So this kind of a policy failure is I see is there is a disconnect over there.
Many more dimensions to it, and I'm sure you will realize.
Okay.
Lalit ji.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for such an interesting session. And I was very intrigued to understand that the housing as a notion started during the times of Industrial Revolution. I had a question, ma'am. The Industrial Revolution led to rapid urbanization around centers of development, which were basically mechanized industries, which could do a which involved a lot of labor, which led to migration from the rural areas. I want to understand that we have another Industrial Revolution 4.0, which we presently are witnessing with the developments in technology. So, wouldn't the housing requirements that would be coming out of this Industrial Revolution, wherein the youngsters, they are tech savvy, they are not associated with the notion of being settled, but more on the mobile and being global nomads, digital nomads, as I would say, there's a trend upcoming. So, ma'am, would our generation have a different perspective or requirement of housing as a notion altogether?
Yes. Yes.
And ma'am,
Clearly you
because
see that emerging. There are 2-3 kinds of, I would say, housing projects coming up. Number one,
yes, ma'am.
the trend of studio apartments on one hand.
Yes,
There
yes,
was a
ma'am.
time where even 1-bedroom projects and 2-bedroom had become impossible. Right?
Yes,
But we see two of these contrary in some ways trends which are happening in housing projects.
yes, ma'am.
One, you have larger houses. So now 3.5, 4 bedrooms is like becoming a big norm. But on the other hand, similarly, there is a component of studio apartments. You're also having integrated townships. And that is something which is, I think, a form of housing which has really come up in order to suit the current young generation. Everything located within that one complex. You have gymming and your garden and your childcare space and the lobby and the entertainment center and so on and so forth, a clubhouse, whatever, right? So you don't go out. And I think that is something which is, again, something which suits the current generation. No? But very different, let's say, from the public housing in Vienna, where there will be similarities, but there are differences. Like I have visited one of the, it's called Karl Marx homes in Vienna. It's one of the worker colonies which came up during the Industrial Revolution. And firstly, it is built up like a fort, literally fortress all around. And basically, this was because this was the period between the wars. And there were also so nationalistic sentiments getting mixed up with the leftist sentiments and so on and so forth. So it's a mixture kind of a thing. But it has all of these things. So they had very small homes initially, studio apartments, and there were common kitchenettes. There were childcare centers. There is a laundromat there is a preschool, all in that same complex. But if you look at the ethos behind it, it is the workers, let us unite. So hardly any living room space, independent kitchen is like so small kitchenette. Today you will see a whole difference. So they are demolishing some of these public structures, repurposing them for more private ones. Private space is increased. So it's interesting, right? And on the other hand,
Yes,
we are
ma'am.
talking about these integrated townships. So
Yes. That is decentralizing and centralization going on at the same time. And ma'am, I also wanted to understand the concept of built environment as a notion. If we were to say housing, as you said, rightly said, ma'am, that it's supposed to be built from natural available resources, which are available in the area of development, but due to standardization or the regulations, which are so structured to enable the industry to operate, uh, it leads to a number of chaotic things. But, ma'am, if we were to work towards sustainable urban development, if we were to have the kind of development that was beneficial in the long run for the public in the right manner, what kind of steps can we take to initiate public participation in the context of urban development?
I don't think we have the time to discuss this at length,
Okay, ma'am.
but I
Okay,
would
ma'am.
encourage you to read a case study of Bhuj by
Okay.
Manshala. Okay,
By?
Punarshala in Bhuj.
Okay.
So this is post the
Yes,
earthquake.
ma'am.
And again, in
Okay.
Bhuj, there was a lot of housing destruction. Same
Okay.
situation. Lots
Okay.
of unauthorized housing, all vulnerable to the earthquake and therefore buildings falling down. In the wake of that, Punarshala, through their project, they tried to create a set of building control rules which accommodated some of the traditional materials. Uh, they were fairly successful, I'm saying, in pushing some of those. Okay?
Okay,
So
ma'am.
it's a very good case study to actually learn from.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
And,
Ma'am, yeah, one last question. In context to climate change, ma'am, the urban development or the traditional development, it has been going around the historically developed places, but tier two, tier three cities are the new go-to places for the upcoming generations. The migration patterns are changing, and we are preferring eco stays or stays which are more comfortable in the environmental context. So in that context, ma'am, if there was the present migration patterns, the climate change would lead to chaotic scenarios in the already developed places. So how could we cater to housing or those components while addressing the climate change challenges?
so green housing, I think, is just emerging.
Yes, ma'am.
And unfortunately, currently it is present mostly applied into the commercial buildings.
Yes, ma'am. There is a energy conservation building code which allows for green buildings and
But you
standardization.
see, within the residential,
Hmm.
the incorporation of green building principles is very, very limited. In fact,
Yes.
here in Chandigarh, there is something called a eco city.
Okay.
But that eco city is also based on, what should I say, very superficial green principles. So,
Yes.
which are, I think, essentially brown, but there is a
Yes.
greenwashing which is happening.
Yes, ma'am.
So, I think the more that the demand increases, we don't want just nature proximate housing, but we want nature compliant, nature
Yes.
engaging
Yes.
housing. And that
Yes.
that has to, I think, come the demand sector now has to shape some of the housing market.
Ma'am, could you just repeat the last two words? They were very complimentary.
Nature compliant rather than greenwashing.
Nature compliant rather than nature vicinity, something you said, ma'am.
I said not in the proximity of nature.
Proximity, yeah. Nature proximity versus nature compliant. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
you. Sonam ji. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Sonam ji.
Sonam ji, can you hear us?
That she want to put in the Q&A?
Maybe you can put your question in the chat box or the Q&A box.
Audible, I am?
Yeah, now you are. Yes.
Thank you. So wanted to thank you, Amita ma'am, for today's session. It was really insightful because living in informal settlements, we have been heard कि अभी resettlement आया, SRA आएंगे या, but till now we see कि ऐसा बस होते आ रहा है. But there is a interesting fact that you shared, the contractual worker or the contractor who is ground means some are contractors are linked with political parties or else, but yeah, so based on that we know कि ये कहीं ना कहीं रुकता है क्योंकि पॉलिटिक्स का पार्ट या मेजर इन्फ्लुएंस है. सो बेस्ड ऑन जो एक्चुअल या इफेक्टिव कॉन्ट्रैक्टर जो यूजफुल हो सकता है एज अ डेवलपमेंट, वो कैसे प्रोसेस हो सकती है पॉसिबल या अप्रोच कैसे किया जा सकता.
Okay. So there are some very interesting experiments which are going on in many European countries as well. And not that they are not happening in our country. Okay? So one is the entire idea of self-redevelopment. So where communities get together, acquire land rights, then decide their mode of redevelopment and ask for finance from financial institutions. So a mix of keeping the land rights as part of the overall deposit and getting the finance. Now there are countries which have made this into a policy. So for example, in Thailand, they have this policy which is called Ban Macron. And in this policy, there is a government agency which creates organized groups within informal settlements, encourages them to think about their land, the land on which is being occupied, in terms of its financial value, and then take decisions about whether they want to stay in this place and redevelop themselves, whether they want to shift to another place which is more on the periphery and develop themselves, or whether they want to go in for some simple redevelopment improvement policies. Okay? So this is happening in Thailand. Okay? There are some other places which also have these kind of policies, but Thailand represents one of the most successful programs because this is an agency which both organizes as well as gives finance. Okay, and finance which is not, so in our country, I think unfortunately we have come up with this thing right called the free housing, which destroys the demand end completely and allows the government to manipulate. Right? Because they say free housing, aap kaun aaye मांगने वाले. In fact, now there are demands from developers कि कोई भी developer होने दो, community को choice नहीं चाहिए. Okay? It should be the government which should decide who will be the developer. Okay? So in Ban Bangkok, I think the element of choice and agency stays with the community. So it's a very nice example. So self-redevelopment is something we can keep in mind. The second other options are like in places like Odisha and Punjab. Today, informal dwellers are being given individual land rights. Now, of course, that may not be possible in large metropolises like Mumbai, Delhi, etc., because the land prices are very high. But that is one option in emerging towns and cities. Okay? For example, even Nagpur has a land right policy for that matter. Okay? Where settlements can get land rights, but these are collective land rights. Then the experiments in Europe that I was talking about, so people themselves have come up with concepts like co-housing. Okay? So where a group of youngsters, let's say, gets together, okay? They look at the budgets that they have and they approach a developer, negotiate, okay? And then buy an apartment where they try their own ways in which to cross-subsidize by having some commercial use, some residential use, some collective samples. So there are a lot of these kinds of, what should I say, experiments which are going on in Europe, in places like Berlin, Switzerland, also in places. So those are, I think, some interesting models to look at.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Since we're running short on time, I request the participants who have further questions to please put your questions in the Q&A box. Ma'am, I think if you have the time, maybe you can answer it in the Q&A box itself.
Sure.
And we move on to the next session. Thank you very much, ma'am. It was very insightful and engaging. We hope to see you in further improvements as well. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next session, I am delighted to invite Dr. Praveen Kumar, Assistant Professor at the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Studies, School of Habitat Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. He will introduce the topic Dynamics of Urban Vulnerabilities. Warm welcome, sir, and over to you.
Hello, can you hear me, Shweta?
Yes, yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, yeah. Firstly, good evening to all. Again, thank you. Hello. 1 second. I think this So, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, yeah, again, good evening to all. Again, very excited for this session. We're looking forward to some maybe discussion later on in the vulnerability concept in the urban ecosystem. So, I'm going to, can I share my screen?
Yes, sir, you can.
Yeah, okay. Is it visible?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay, great. So yeah, so what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about the dynamics of urban vulnerability. So, when we talk about urban, probably you are now on the session, you're already familiar with what urban is. And now let's delve towards the vulnerability part of this urban ecosystem. So what we're going to do, firstly, let me give you an idea. I'm talking about thinking. So can you see the slides moving?
No, sir. We can only see the first slide, the cover slide. Yeah, yes, now we can.
Great. So yeah, so let me give you a brief idea about what I do. So I work mostly on socio-ecological systems. I work on climate change, vulnerabilities, risk, resilience, and mostly adaptation part. So in this section, what I'm going to talk about, we will discuss about the vulnerability part, like how to define vulnerability in the context of urban ecosystem. We're going to talk about different complex factors which shape urban vulnerabilities. And then we'll talk about the resilience of urban cities and the ecosystem. And lastly, we're going to talk about some solutions, the basic interventions, how we can reduce the vulnerability, and how we can talk about the adaptation part. So coming back to this picture, I mean, it's very familiar kind of picture. So, in Mumbai, if you from Mumbai and surrounding areas, you can see this picture and like there's two sides of this, image, basically. On the one side, what you can see is like mostly informal settlement, which is basically your slum area, and the other side is the like formal settlement. So given any city, like for example in India, some of them, I mean, again, given our like planning and formal planning, we always come up with these two such types of settlements, formal and informal. And given like how we are already urbanizing at a very fast pace nowadays, around 36% of our population living in the urban areas, and I think around 2035 will be around 42% will be living in the urban areas. So given that scenario, so we need the urban spaces are becoming more and more crunched. So like with again with more urbanization, more acclimation is also happening, and they are also creating some kind of problems, and they are also putting a lot of pressure on your resources in terms of the natural resources, in terms of your let's say other kind of any other kind of resources that we have in a city. Either it will be all the dimensions, social, ecological, or economical dimensions. So so again, one more thing is that in the urban ecosystem, you have the all of our global like problems, issues, challenges. They mostly arise from the urban areas and the lifestyle we have in the urban ecosystem. I mean, you can connect any, for example, climate change. Most of the things, for example, the emissions, mostly they are centered around big cities and big urban ecosystems. And this is why we need to understand how these challenges, issues, especially in the context of climate change, they are creating different vulnerability profiles among the different diversity of people, or also different sectors of the within the city. So going forward with that, so again, everybody knows that these are the 17 SDGs. And in a city, even as well, you can see most of the SDGs are applicable. We focus mostly on what climate action, we focus mostly on sustainable cities and communities, we focus on poverty and so on. But again, like, is there any holistic approach for applying or implementing these SDGs and how successful they are? Given the time frame we have for like fulfilling the SDG goals, are we already there or not in terms of sustainable cities and communities? And if you try to combine with the climate action, you can see that most of our Indian cities, they are already facing a high profile of vulnerability. They are, in some cases, with respect to climate impacts, such as heat waves, such as we can say, like any kind of disaster or hazard, they are facing very high profile of vulnerability. So like looking into that, now we also need to understand in the context of vulnerability. So before going into vulnerability, we need to ask three important questions. We have three important questions we need to ask about vulnerability, which basically are, firstly, we need to understand what is vulnerability. So to set a context, because see, vulnerability again is a very like interdisciplinary kind of phenomenon. So what aspect we are looking for vulnerability, with what context we are looking for vulnerability, we need to define the vulnerability part. Second is basically what and who is vulnerable. So when we say what and who is vulnerable, basically we're targeting what is our target audience, whether we're looking for a community, whether we're looking for any kind of sector, whether we're looking for any kind of region. So this is how you say what and who is vulnerable. And the next question comes is that is vulnerable to what? Which is again a very important element because vulnerability is not always with respect to your climate change. It also can be regard to your disaster, can be regard to your hazard, can be regard to your risk. So you need to again make sure vulnerable to what? When you're talking about vulnerability to climate change, you're talking about vulnerability to any kind of disaster, talking about vulnerability to maybe let's say in terms of socioeconomic characters. So you need to be very certain about these three questions before jumping into the vulnerability profile or maybe any kind of vulnerability assessment for any system. So these are the three very important questions that we need to be taken care of. Now coming to that dimension part, okay. So every social ecological system, or you can say socio-ecological system, or in this case the urban ecosystem, they have three dimensions. We all know that economy, environment, society, they all interplay with each other to make a like coherent system. And in this case, you can in the case of urban ecosystem, you can also add maybe infrastructural, you can also add maybe governance and political kind of systems. Altogether, they work to make a coherent system in which again, impact in any of these one system is going to affect, like the other dimensions as well. So, for example, if your environment, for example, is suffering a lot, is facing or is becoming more and more exposed to climate impact, and its sensitivity is also decreasing, then overall your whole system might will be more vulnerable, might will be more at risk. So again, we need to have a like coherent kind of holistic approach where we can look from all these dimensions together so that we can come up and reduce our vulnerability. So we'll learn about the concepts of vulnerabilities, the different components of vulnerabilities in the upcoming slides. But yeah, this is very important that the dimensions are important. If we are going to look any city, any ecosystem or any system, we make sure what are the dimensions that system, encompasses or basically has what kind of dimensions it has or what or maybe what are your maybe climate change impacts are affecting these different dimensions. So yeah, again, in terms of social, you can talk about maybe demographics, poverty, and in terms of economics, let's say you can talk about like poverty, employment levels, and so on. Environment, you know that basically pollution, climate is. I mean, given the condition right now in the bigger city in Delhi, than India, you can see how big of a problem they are, and what kind of problems in terms of like health, in terms of their resilience of the city they are causing. Next is your infrastructure, which could be your housing, utilities, and transport. And then lastly, your again, very important element of this, which is again missing from this picture, is the governance in the political setting. Which again, for example, if you have a weaker governance structure or maybe a lack of proper planning, it is going to affect your vulnerability. So yeah, these are the three and four couple of dimensions of urban vulnerability. So now, based on this and the vulnerability part, we have this framework. This is again a very important framework from IPCC report, and what it says that in brief that how your three components, which are basically hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, they are affecting and creating a higher risk. So if you apply this framework on any Indian city, you can calculate hazard, you can calculate their vulnerability, you can see that what kind of exposures they are having. For example, it could be maybe exposure in the sense that maybe higher temperatures, maybe some kind of cold waves, maybe some kind of disasters or hazards that they are facing. So based on that, you can easily say that, okay, my city is at risk and my city is at lower risk or higher risk. And if you, once again, if you see, I can show them. Maybe later, okay. I want to share some like a in video, maybe I will share in the later, after completing the slide. So in this case, then your hazard and vulnerability are high. So what it will cause? It will cause some kind of maybe a disaster, maybe some kind of maybe a higher risk, which is going to suppose you don't have better capacity, you don't have a better adaptive capacity. So in this case, your risk is going to be higher, and hence you need to reduce the risk so that you can prevent any kind of disaster or any kind of let's say hazard to become much more higher and higher. Secondly, in case of what if you want to reduce your risk, you also need to focus on improving your adaptive capacity of maybe let's say for example if you're looking at a community system. In this case, if let's say suppose they are facing some kind of flooding, they're facing higher temperatures, and so these are their exposures. And based on their like adaptive capacity, which what kind of resources they have, what kind of information they have, it is going to affect their risk profile. It could be higher, it could be lower, depending on these three elements. So this framework is very important whenever you are assessing, let's say, vulnerability of any system. You should look into this framework. This is an important part of vulnerability assessment. So now coming to the concept, because see, I'm talking about a lot about vulnerability, but I have not explained it to you. What does vulnerability mean? What does basically this term mean? The term has very different meanings. I mean, in simple, if you can say that, I mean, it basically indicates the level of harm on a system due to different climate change impact. Simple. But if you're looking from a climate change perspective, IPCC has defined the vulnerability in a way that let's break down this definition, which says that the degree to which a system is susceptible to or unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. So what does it mean that it is a degree? It is like a measure. There, what you're doing is you're trying to let's say measure let's say degree of a system, whether my system is at harm or whether my system is not at harm, where that system is facing some kind of impact from climate change. Again, it could be maybe sea level rise, it could be coastal flooding, it could be higher temperatures, and any kind of climate variability or any kind of extreme. So that defines the vulnerability part. Now comes very important element of the vulnerability, which is key component, which are exposure, which is sensitivity, and the adaptive capacity. So vulnerability in itself is a function of their character, their magnitude, and in the end, it's a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Again, we're going to learn about all these words as well. So overall, what I can say about vulnerability is that it is an extent to which a community, structure, services, or any geographical area is likely to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of any particular hazard, or maybe on account of their nature, construction, proximity to hazardous terrains, or a disaster-prone area. So it gives you an idea how much what is the level of their harm, what is the level of, let's say, how much susceptible they are to any disaster, any hazard, or any kind of impact. So this gives you an idea. Secondly, that again, why it is necessary, because we talk about the vulnerabilities, in terms you will find today a lot of reports, a lot of papers about the vulnerabilities. Nowadays, in the last 20 years, the research on vulnerabilities, especially in different contexts, in urban ecosystems, in forestry, in socio-ecological systems, this concept has been increasing further and further. So why it is necessary is that basically you do that to determine the risk, hazard, and the coping and adaptation mechanism. What does this mean basically? That you need, once you know that okay, my system is at that level of vulnerability, accordingly you can plan your, let's say, coping practice. You can plan the adaptation mechanism. What kind of policy measures? What kind of let's say coping practices my system needs? Maybe my system is not vulnerable and I'm putting the resources. Let's suppose we have two systems. One, according to your assessment, is one cities have lower vulnerability to any climate change, and one has a higher vulnerability of climate change. And but what we are doing is the government is providing more resources to the city, which is not much vulnerable. The other is much more vulnerable. So in this case, once you do the vulnerability assessment and you see that okay, there's a difference, so now you can basically allocate your resources accordingly. That the system was more vulnerable, need better resources to cope with the impact. So accordingly, you will do that. So here, this is why doing the vulnerability assessment is important. Second part is that because the in the end, policy makers and decision makers, they are the ones who will do all the kind of things, who will make these policies, who will make these schemes, who will make these different projects. So they also need a reference point on what basis they will say, okay, which system needs this kind of schemes more, which system needs this kind of projects more, and so on. So again, it helps in providing that information to the policymakers and decision makers. And lastly, for vulnerability, as I mentioned earlier, it's an interdisciplinary phenomenon. When I say interdisciplinary phenomenon, because it's not just that one element can define vulnerability. It's not just social science can define vulnerability. Vulnerability encompasses of different areas and different fields. Maybe once when you're calculating vulnerability, you can use different indicators. Maybe let's say suppose from environment, you can use social indicators, you can use economical indicators. So in that way, you are not doing just one aspect of any dimension. You are trying to bridge all of them together, trying to create a bigger picture of the system, and then in a way, it is an interdisciplinary phenomenon. Okay. So now this is about the vulnerability. Second is Why this matters? Why? Because now we try to connect with the urban vulnerability. Why it matters? Given the conditions of the current scenario, there's a rapid urbanization, rapid unchecked urbanization happening in our cities, and we're seeing a lot of climate change impact in our cities, social inequalities, economic disparities, which again making our areas, making our like urban cities more and more vulnerable to the different risks, and also amplifying their impact on communities. When I say amplify, because uh, I mean, you can say that the cities are facing this impact, the cities are getting this kind of changes, and accordingly, they are unable to cope with the impact. They do not, maybe the system does not have proper understanding, the system does not have a proper idea of what my exposure levels are, what my sensitivity levels are, what my affective capacity levels are. So again, they are not able to, and like basically reduce their vulnerability. And this is why they are in a way amplifying their impact on let's say the communities. So this is why urban vulnerability matters, and we need to look from a vulnerability lens how our cities, especially like bigger cities, smaller cities, or any kind of urban area, are facing the heat of climate change impact. Yeah. So yeah, again, if you are more interested in vulnerability, this is a report from IPCC 6 assessment report. Again, if you can go and read the report. At least it's not the whole report, but there are a couple of like summaries for policymakers. There's also a technical summary, so you can go ahead and go read about, because this report talks about impact, adaptation, and vulnerability. This is basically from the working group second of IPCC, and here you will find like how globally, how globally vulnerability is basically is in the picture, how adaptation is, how adaptation is coming into the picture, and how different impacts different regions are facing. So go through that report. At least try to read the technical summary and the policy summary for that report. Okay. Now coming back to the cities and coming back to the vulnerability, there are multiple types of vulnerability in cities which takes place. Most commonly, you have three types of vulnerability, which is physical vulnerability. Second is economical vulnerability, and last one is the social vulnerability. So again, in physical vulnerability, you can talk about maybe the houses, the infrastructural, or it also basically depending on the physical location of people and the elements which are at risk, and the technical capacity of buildings, structures, and any other kind of infrastructure. It could vary according to the construction techniques, materials, use location, and so on. So this physical vulnerability talks about mostly the structures, the buildings, and the houses, and so on. Second is the economic vulnerability, where in this case, for example, the system a city works on, like for example, we have our own economic system over there, and in some system we have some rich people, we have some poor people. So again, if you talk about that, poor people are considered to be more vulnerable as their houses, suppose their houses are like they do not have much resources, their houses are again built of weak materials, maybe, they're living in informal settlement, they do not have proper safety nets, to recover from any kind of impact, and they lose the essential tools and types of equipment for the livelihood as well. So the economic vulnerability is also playing around in an urban area as well. And lastly, very importantly, is social vulnerability, which although we live in an urban area, but still is large is playing around. So what does social vulnerability mean? Means that some sections of our society, some sections of population living in an urban area are more vulnerable to, let's say, the other section or other communities of the people living in an urban area. For example, like women, children, elderly people, marginal groups, or maybe some other kind of challenged people, and who which are dependent on the critical facilities. So social vulnerability is also coming to the picture. And it is not only just these three, there are other types of vulnerabilities as well. For example, you have cultural vulnerability. Sometimes you combine social and economic, so you create a socio-economic vulnerability. Sometimes you combine all of them together, you create a socio-ecological vulnerability, educational vulnerability, livelihood vulnerability, and so on. So there are so many things, but commonly most of your vulnerability part will revolve around these three concepts: physical, economic, and social. And last, maybe in some cases, political vulnerability as well. So these are the three types of vulnerability. Okay. So here you can also see, for example, you have types of vulnerability assessment. You have physical or biophysical vulnerability, your social vulnerability, socioeconomic, hazard-specific vulnerability, or integrated vulnerability assessment. So in this case, again, you have different components of the vulnerabilities. Maybe in the physical part, you have hazard, exposure, sensitivity. In the integrated vulnerability, you have biophysical, social. So in a way, you are combining different things together to get a better picture of a vulnerability in a given region. The main point is that it's not just one vulnerability will give you a better picture. Sometimes you need to combine different sets of vulnerability to see what plays in that particular community or maybe in the city. Okay. So if you are interested again, this is a very good paper on vulnerability. It is one of the milestone paper in the case of vulnerability. It is usually openly available. You can go and check it out. It talks about how vulnerability comes into the you can see into the research field, and how it also talks about how this term has been used throughout in the last couple of years, in the last decade as well, and how it also talks about the future projection of vulnerability research as well. So I will suggest you highly to, if you're looking from a vulnerability perspective, at least go through this paper and get a better perspective on the vulnerability as concept. Okay. Now, remember I told you there are three components of vulnerability, basically like exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So coming to these three concepts here, yeah. So here, again, IPCC defines all these three components of vulnerability, which are again very important if you are trying to assess any vulnerability or using any kind of framework. So exposure is what? Exposure is again, it's refers to the duration, frequency, and intensity of any impact or a stressor operating on a system, and it is defined as a property of the system interaction with a disturbance rather than the system itself. So in simple way, I can say that. I mean, here, let's suppose we have a system, we have a community, and some kind of external element, for example, climatic element in this case, you have extreme precipitation, you have extreme temperature, you have, in some cases, snowfall in other like bigger like northern cities. So these are the external factors that are in a some kind of stress on your system. So that refers to your exposure. So even the IPCC says that the nature and degree to which a system is exposed to significant climatic variations. So whenever there is any climatic variations which are operating on your system or a city, it will refer to as a exposure part. Second is the sensitivity. Now it is in a way it is basically an understanding or basically a threshold value which talks about like how a system is sensitive to a stress or like how a system is more sensitive to an impact. And so here it can be either, so in this case, it either could be the direct effect or the indirect effect. So if we go through the IPCC definition of sensitivity, it says that the degree to which a system is affected, again, like we are talking about a measure here, and the system, you can place any system, city, community, or maybe a region, or maybe some kind of state or something, which is getting affected by the climate-related stimuli. In this climate-related stimuli means some kind of impact, some kind of stresses which are operating on the system. The effect may be direct or indirect because sometimes what will happen that, you can say indirect impact, for example, where this is a change in crop yield in response to change in the mean temperature range. So if your temperature range is changing, could happen that your crop yield could also change. Secondly, is indirect, for example, damage caused by increased frequency of coastal flooding, which is sea level rise. Sea level rise is happening, it is again caused by the global warming, but it is also causing, different damages of the coastal area. So again, this could be direct and indirect effect. And so one more thing is that the sense, in this case, you have to be make very sure, understand that sensitivity can be positive as well as can be negative in the case. So again, because the impacts are maybe sometimes what happens that there is an impact on a system, but the system is acting positively. Again, when I say positively, it could be to you, to maybe one particular sector. For example, what if there is, for example, if there is a region which was not getting any water, But now, because of climate change effect, they are getting water, they are getting rainfall. Although it's a bad for overall environment and overall system because the dynamics are changing, that it could change the whole ecosystem. But for some particular set of some particular maybe system, it could be positive as well. So you also have to be careful whether it's not just negative or positive. You have to see what is the context of that particular region and then accordingly decide the sensitivity. Last one is the adaptive capacity, which is a very important element of the component that because if again let's break down the definition first. So it says that the ability of a system to adjust to climate change. So in a way, it's just my resources, it's just my ability. Whether if I'm facing any, for example, if you any whenever you feel like have a rainfall, you open your umbrella. Okay, if you have an umbrella, you will open your umbrella. It's like okay, I have a something and I have an ability, I can counter the rainfall. For example, if you're feeling cold, maybe you can put on some clothes. So again, that I have the clothes, I have the resources. So again, I have the ability to adjust to the climate change. So these are the some basic things. So in a way, I have a better adaptive capacity. Now, if I'm standing in the rain and I don't have an umbrella, so I will get totally wet in the water. And so same thing goes with the cold. If I don't have any clothes, then I will also get cold because I don't have the resources. So since in a way, adaptive capacity also works in the same way. So how you're adjusting to the climate change impact? Whether, I mean, it could be smaller like climate variabilities or maybe the climate extreme to moderate your potential damage and also to take your advantage of the opportunities or also to how you cope with the consequences. So if I again have to break it down, that this refers to the system's ability to adjust to the shock and different kind of stressors. Uh, See, sometimes people get confused between adaptive capacity and the adaptation part, but they both are different. You have to be, like, see in different. Adaptive capacity is my potential, like whether I have that or not. But once if I have adaptive capacity, I can make it into an adaptation practice. Okay, I can give you an example in this case. Uh, let's take the umbrella problem. Again, there's a heavy rainfall happening, and suppose there's a not heavy, normal rainfall is happening, and I have an umbrella, or maybe I have a rain jacket. So I have a rain jacket, but what if I'm not using it? What even I'm not using it. So my adaptive capacity is there, but I'm not using it and making it used to reduce the impact of that rainfall is what stopping me to doing the adaptation part. So adaptation basically starts from your adaptive capacity, whether you have the resources or not. So in this case, if I open the umbrella, then I'm doing an adaptation part. I'm adjusting to the climate impact. But if I'm not using it, then basically I'm not doing any adaptation. However, I still have the umbrella, my adaptive capacity will remain the same. Okay. So these are the three components of vulnerability. So for example, if your exposure increases, your vulnerability will increase, your sensitivity will increase, your vulnerability will increase. But if your adaptive capacity will increase, your vulnerability will decrease. Okay. So there are a couple of frameworks which are used in vulnerability assessment. For example, we have very commonly used the IPCC framework, which is, which mostly used for the climate change research, risk and vulnerability based studies. Then you have the UNDRR risk hazard framework, which is mostly used for assessing the risk and disaster management. And then so on, you have other frameworks, and this is just a very small number of frameworks. Then you have a lot of number of frameworks which can be used for your vulnerability assessment, risk assessment, and so on. So coming to the main big framework which is commonly used is this one. This is an IPCC framework. Here, for example, suppose you have a system which is facing some kind of climatic and non-climatic factor, any kind of impact or any kind of exposure to state. So again, remember the three components: exposure, sensitivity. So the system will have exposure because of the climatic variations, climatic extremes. Then the system accordingly will have its own sensitivity. Whether again, for example, the threshold value, it can be in terms of the shocks, in terms of stresses it is having. So all together, these two together, based on these two things, it is going to cause some impact afterwards. Again, depending on your electric capacity now, suppose if you have some electric capacity, some you have the resources, if you have that, it is going to decrease your impact basically. And then further, it is going to affect your vulnerability. So here, More exposure, more sensitivity will create more vulnerability. More adaptive capacity will reduce your impact as well as your vulnerability. So applying this, there are a lot of studies which have applied this same framework to the cities as well. So again, coming to this one, here what they have used a different external internal drivers within a city, and they have used socio-economic and land use scenarios within a city, and to see what, again, using different indicators such as social factors, like personal factors, environmental factors, again, the three dimensions that we talked about earlier, and they use the component like adaptive capacity, sensitivity, and exposure, and they calculate the vulnerability part. So again, you can also do that, but you need to know your different indicators. Again, what dimensions you are considering within a city or maybe the boundary of a city, and what drivers you have. Could be external drivers, could be internal drivers. Okay, so if you ask me like, sir, how to do the maybe the overall vulnerability assessment, how to start with the process. So simply, again, I'm not going into very much detail into that, but let me briefly give you an idea. So you start with your scoping and objective part first. Okay, I need to identify what sector, what from, like, for example, what kind of vulnerability I want to do. Then you select your method for assessment. Then you select your like again sector. Okay, you want to work on a community, you want to work on a region. Then you select your, especially your indicators. Now this step is very important, selection of your indicators. Now, indicators you can also classify according to the three component: exposure, sensitivity, predictive capacity, or you can classify according to dimensions: social indicator, economic indicator, ecological indicator, or other kind of indicator. Then you need to like get this data and then normalize the data. And normalization basically means to get rid of all the units from the data so that your numbers would be between 0 to 1 value. And then finally, you will assign them like some weights. Weights basically means some indicators are much more important than the other indicators. So accordingly, you will assign the weights. There are a couple of methods for that. We have AHP method, analytical hair process. You have PCA method, principal component analysis method. Or you can also use, average weight method, also commonly used, projection and available method. So there are a lot of methods available to identify the weights of indicators. Finally, you can make an index, which could be you can call a vulnerability index. So you can aggregate all the indicators together and can have an idea, okay, how your system is vulnerable or not. Then you can again represent through some charts and tables. You can rank all of your, for example, if you're working on a multiple cities, you can rank different cities accordingly. And lastly, once you have that, you can also identify the drivers of what was causing this vulnerability, what was the main reason for this vulnerability. So this is an overall like different steps which we usually use in vulnerability assessment. Okay. Now coming to the problems in urban areas, see, lot of problems are there, lot of issues are there, which makes the vulnerability to go higher in this region. So again, very common issues we have, like environmental issues are there, social ills, like for example, poverty is like also there, drinking water, pollution, emissions factor, and so on. So all these things, create, again, it's also increasing your sensitivity, it is also increasing your different exposure level, and given all these conditions, you might also, have a lower adaptive capacity. So these problems are there. These are causing, higher levels of vulnerability within our cities. Given what kind of inequality in the kind of, the resource allocation we have, so we are having higher problem. Again, these problems are like ultimately causing the higher vulnerability. If you see along, although we are saying we are becoming more and more urbanized, we are getting more and more better services, but along with the benefits of urbanization, agglomeration also comes. So, for example, see, urban areas, cities like Mumbai, Delhi, bigger Bengaluru, and all, they provide some better opportunities, so a lot of socio-economic opportunities for jobs, for maybe income generation. But are also, these areas are also simultaneously becoming increasingly risky places to live. Especially for the low income residents or maybe the poor, or you can say marginal communities or poor communities, which they live in the cities. You can see some, like a lot of some areas are like that. A lot of migrant workers come for the job, for better opportunities. But cities are not very friendly for them in terms of providing them space, in terms of providing them a better space environment. So ultimately, they move to maybe they may live in a say unsafe environment, They might live in an environment which is not even suitable for making houses, but they make the houses and so on. That process of like radiation will start, and that will lead to their higher sensitivity, and that will lead to their higher exposure to the different impacts of climate change, and ultimately will lead to their higher vulnerability. So yeah, again, I mean, in the end, I will say that I mean, although these areas are directly or indirectly causing the global environmental problem, but these impacts that are being felt are the same at micro level and urban level. And I'm also not saying that only the, let's say, poor community or the marginal communities they have higher vulnerability. People living in the former settlements also have these kind of vulnerabilities, but their scale might be different, but their degree might be different. For example, if you see in Delhi nowadays, we are seeing a lot of news regarding the AQI, the air quality index. Not just, of course, the poor people are getting affected more because they do not have, let's say, I mean, a good, I mean, rich people can buy air filters, they can live in a clean environment, safe environment. But as a poor people, it is very difficult for them to, like get these kind of resources. But again, it's not just the rich cannot feel this kind of impact. The rich people can also have this impact. They can also have this kind of vulnerability. But the scale will be a little bit lower as compared to the marginal or the poor people. Okay. So coming to the major factors which affect your urban vulnerability, I have divided into a couple of like types. For example, physical and environmental vulnerability. You have climate change impact. You have geographical vulnerability, in which you can talk about rising temperatures, sea level rise, maybe your flooding, heat waves, and so on. So these are your basic, physical and environmental factors which affect the urban vulnerability. In terms of socioeconomic, we have discussed about, so we have poverty, inequality, population density, informal settlements, and so on. Yeah, and then we have the institutional and governance, where we can talk about weak planning and enforcement, and we have corruption, resource allocations, and policy gaps. There are multiple factors as well, but these are the major cruxes, or you can say the major portion of the factors which affect the urban vulnerability. Then you have the technological infrastructure vulnerability, where the aging infrastructure of smart cities, all these things can again lead to a higher vulnerability. So if I take an example of, let's say, Mumbai city. So in Mumbai city, all these factors are there, all these kind of like indicators are there. For example, sea level rise, for example, rising temperature. Mumbai city, flooding, flood-like situation. In the monsoon time, in some part of Mumbai, we face like flood-like situation in some places. And heat waves in summer days is also, in summertime, it's also becoming common phenomenon across the Maharashtra as well as across the northern part of India. In terms of socioeconomic, say, poverty and inequality, again, Mumbai, I'll show you the first picture from Mumbai, how the poverty is there and how these inequalities are there. They have the inequality of the wealth, the inequality of the distribution of the resources, and so on. So again, in Mumbai, this populations which is living in informal settlements, they face higher risk and have the limited resources for the disaster or recovery. Then population density again in Mumbai is quite high, living in a small space and so many people living in this space. So they have to fight for the resources. And then informal settlements. So again, Mumbai again is known for a lot of informal settlements together, and how they lack like good infrastructure. They do not have proper planning. They do not have the even sometimes basic facilities such as like water, like toilet facilities, and so on. Or in terms of institutional governance thing, then over in Mumbai, you can say about. I think it's common for every city that how the policy gaps are there. Still, even after a lot of research, even after a lot of you can say output and projects, still the level of vulnerability is not becoming better and better. And lastly, like this aging infrastructure. So every city is like crumbling in India nowadays. Although we are getting new infrastructure day by day, but still our old infrastructure, such as bridges, such as you can say transportations and so on, they are still not being you can say modified or being you can say adaptable to the current requirement or need. So this is what we are facing. So these are just some common factors or like indicators that are affecting your urban vulnerability. Okay. So now coming to like, are we really facing climate change impact in urban areas? Is it really the case? I mean, in some cities we can say that if someone says that we are not facing any impact, or maybe we are not facing any kind of, it's just a normal way of climate. It changes and it goes back to its normal self. But if you see in an urban area, especially to the environmental risk, exposure is increasing for sure. I mean, again, it is that higher exposure is causing, like higher vulnerability. Urban areas, although they have all the facilities, better infrastructure, they are not disaster prone. They are not. When if a disaster strikes here, we'll have maybe in some cases higher loss and damage. We can see they have a higher risk basically. And also because of this rapid urbanization and the population movement around the here and there, which is part of cities, could affect your vulnerability as well. How this higher population living in small spaces, maybe what it is an impact, bigger impact. Like for example, a landslide, maybe what it is like a flood-like event. So it will cause major damage. Again, the most affected would be your low-income urban dwellers, which living mostly in the informal settings. So yeah, I mean, in a way, so I would say that the changing environment brought about by both man-made factors and natural factors, it is creating vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities that we are facing now, I mean, it is solvable. There are solutions for that to reduce the vulnerability. Again, multiple maybe by again, I will talk about it in the coming slide. So how we can reduce the vulnerability. Okay. Yeah. So in terms of models and tools, for example, this is you can use GIS mapping, which is very commonly used nowadays for assessment of any kind of vulnerability. You can make vulnerability indices. Different indexes are being used. For example, I mentioned the economic, sociological vulnerability index. We have vulnerability index. We have economic vulnerability index. So there are a couple of there are a lot of indices available which are being used for assessing the vulnerability. Lastly, you can do resource and community mapping, which again gives you an idea how and where your resources are and how what kind of communities are living in an area. So if you see on the right side of this slide is basically the flood vulnerable zones in Mumbai. So again, what it does that we now know which regions are facing which are higher vulnerable to flood. For example, in this case. So accordingly, we can plan or like our policies, our adaptation mechanisms accordingly so that we can reduce their vulnerability. So this is why vulnerability assessment is important. Okay. Okay, couple of good readings I will suggest. For example, the first one, the assessing of the dynamics of urban vulnerability to climate change. Here they've taken the Helsinki case. What they've talked about is that they're saying that there is a gap in understanding what drives future climate vulnerability. So they're saying, currently there's no proper understanding of what would be the future in terms of vulnerability in cities and how to account for this spatial emergence. So again, a very interesting read. It also talks about the different connection between the drivers and change in vulnerability indicators. So yeah, it's a good read for you guys. Second one is the conceptualizing urban vulnerability to global climate and environmental change. Here they are exploring how urban vulnerability has been framed in the recent climate change and this research. So they're looking at urban vulnerability and how it has been changed throughout in the last 20 years, and also examining the contribution and different limitations of each approaches which can be used for research and the policy purpose. So these are the two I will suggest you to read about the urban vulnerability. So we talked about a couple of factors earlier. One of the major factors in urban landscape, which comes to is the poverty. In terms of poverty, you can see that basically we define poverty as lack of access to basic needs such as food, shelter, and healthcare. But is it the poverty? Is it just that if you do not have the basic needs, food, shelter, and healthcare, you will be called as you will be classified as under the poverty. You will be classified as under a poverty per person. So also inequality is also comes into the picture when you have poverty. Inequality will also comes up. So in a way that what kind of resources we are getting, what kind of services we are getting, what kind of opportunities we are getting. Suppose we have a pool of people and some are like quite wealthy, some are not wealthy. So is there a proper distribution of resources? Is there a proper distribution of the services? So these are the couple of things that again can lead to different types of vulnerabilities among a city. So you need to understand this relationship between the poverty, inequality, and climate change because again they are also interconnected. Sometimes can have a significant impact on each other. So, for example, if you can see like in any of the cities here, there's a very vast difference between the wealth, vast difference between the type of like the accommodation that people live in, formal settlements, informal settlements. The green cover nowadays is becoming much more luxurious. So you make like, like a gooder places, in better places, you have better green cover than the informal settlements. So these things are creating a higher sense of vulnerability. Why? Because if you're not getting these things and you're already increasing your exposure size, you're already increasing your sensitivity, and you do not have the resources, you do not have understanding, you do not have knowledge, you do not have information, that will lead to your lower adaptive capacity. You will not be able to adapt to the situation. So in a way, it is going to cause a higher sense of vulnerability among these people. Okay. So, and now connecting to the climate change with the poor communities. So, as I mentioned earlier, that they are much more vulnerable to the climate change impact because maybe impact like floods, droughts, or extreme weather events, they are becoming more common. In the last 10 to 20 years, if you see, these impacts are becoming more common and common. And because of that, the vulnerability has been changed. And for example, poor communities also lack the basic services, they do not have the resources, which can again impacted by the climate change. If the community is not getting, let's say, water, if they are facing water problem, now they are becoming there's a drought-like condition. So again, that impact will change their vulnerability, leads to higher vulnerability. So the services will change. And again, also the impact of climate change are mostly disproportionate, again, affecting the most vulnerable populations more than the other kind of populations, and mostly, like for example, women, children, indigenous people. In some cases, if you are living in an urban space where they are also doing farming, those kind of farmers as well. Okay. Another good reading for this topic, it would be your like climate change and urban environment sustainability book. And under this, there's a chapter called Why Focusing on Urban Climate Change Resilience in Southeast Asia's Relevant Emergence. Here, now there's a new term which is called resilience. So this term is also becoming a very common term among the cities. So you must have heard like resilient cities. You must have heard like climate-proof cities. So that term is becoming more popular. So how to make your cities more resilient, and so that they will not, whenever they will face any impact, whenever they will face any kind of shocks, they would be able to recover back from themselves. From, let's say, after a shock they move to point B, they will be able to move back to their original point A. So this is why resilience is also important and becoming more and more common among the urban landscape. So there are a couple of factors for that. For example, how you can measure the city resilience. There are four, again, major elements: economy, society, governance, environment. And you can use multiple indicators for that as well, like whether your city is more resilient or not. So in terms of economy, you have the GDP growth rate, you have your for the working population. In terms of society, you can look into from what kind of migration, age, gender, poverty levels, and so on, and income. And in governance, you have what kind of revenues they are generating in terms of community organization, public sector officials and NGOs and so on. And environment, you have green cover, you have the built-up area, you have your maybe like the population density and so on. So using these indicators, the main point is that we can measure the resilience. Again, you must have probably you read some articles, some books nowadays, some maybe some other media. They are saying that city resilience, like for example, climate resilient cities, climate proofing cities, resilient cities. So again, they are mostly the common words which are used to emphasize the idea that cities or maybe your urban systems or maybe your urban communities, they need to be able to quickly recover from climate-related shocks and stresses. So that again, for example, in Mumbai, again I'm taking Mumbai example. So in Mumbai during monsoon time, what if there is a flood-like situation because of the heavy rainfall? Now this stress is happening on the city, and now the city is facing more impact. But after that impact, whether the city is able to go back to its previous self, whether the life will go back to its previous self. So that is where your resilience will come into the picture. Suppose this is a pen, simple pen, and if I everything has its breaking point, which I call a threshold point. So if I try to break it, if I try to bend it will bend for some time. Okay, it will have this kind of like stretchiness and will bend for some time. And this is what the resilience of the pen is. In the same way, if I have a city, if I'm putting some like impact of climate, for example, hazard, disaster, the city will bend for some time. But there will be time come when the pen will basically break. Or the same way, the cities will basically will say, I cannot take on much impact. So in a way, the city is saying this is my threshold value, and after that threshold value, the city will not be classified as a resilient city. So till the threshold value, you can classify your city as threshold, resilient city. But again, calculating the exact threshold value is not easy. You need to have a lot of different indicators. You need to understand the different dynamics because cities again are not just a simple system. They are very complex systems. A lot of things goes into, for example, if you see in the four sectors, economic, society, governance, environment, they all are again, even in themselves, they're complex systems. So what indicators to take, what not to take, it will define your resilience, factor. Okay. So, how to make it much more resilient? Like, for example, this framework talk about how to make it much more resilient city. So you have, for example, in this case, we have divided into multiple aspects: natural system, economic sustainability, physical infrastructure, community preparedness, and the human well-being. So what they're saying is that, so in a city, to make it much more resilient or maybe climate resilient in a better way, you have to have a sustainable resource utilization. You have to have low carbon economy. You have to have energy efficiency and conservation. You have to have reduced climate impact, or maybe let's say to health and safety. And lastly, sustainable landscape and livelihood. So they're saying if the city follows these principles or these kind of aspects in a way, they can become much more resilient. Okay. In terms of now coming to the solutions, I mean, they are simple solutions. See, we know that things are very simple, but the problem is the implementation part. The problem is how to, make sure that we implement the solutions. So coming to the solution part. So again, simply what you have to do, you have to make sure that you map your like urban cities in terms of vulnerabilities, what kind of hazards they are facing. You basically analyze their risk, what kind of communities, what kind of sectors, what kind of regions they are at maybe high risk or low risk, and do the whole assessment for the cities. And then again, in urban areas, we also have different planning zones, we have different like zoning as well. So accordingly, we need to plan accordingly which sector is getting more affected, whether it is my commercial zone, whether it is my industrial zone, whether it is my residential zone, and so on. So we need to figure out these plannings for all the zones altogether because again, whenever climate change impacts will happen, it will going to affect these zones differently. And lastly, you have your business continuity planning. So business continuity planning is again, it basically outlines how a business will continue to operate during and after a disruption. For example, if there is any kind of impact which caused the business to stop working, then how it is going to continue to operate during maybe after the disruption. And the goal of this business continuity planning is just to help a business identify, prevent, and reduce risk, and also respond to or maybe recover from the unexpected event. So again, these are the basic solutions. Again, you also have like course, nature-based solutions are also there. So you can also, depending on the cities and depending on the resources that you have, whether the NBS, nature-based solutions can also be used to reduce the risk. The main thing is that to make, see, exposure, one thing is that you cannot control. Exposure is very hard to control because these are the climate impact that we are facing or we are observing. It is very hard to control. What we can control is we can control the sensitivity of our cities. We can control the adaptive capacity. This is a very important element that we can control. If we can provide them better resources, better awareness should be there, better kind of plans should be there, so that we are improving their adaptive capacity so that their vulnerability will go down. Okay. So lastly, this basically like again, it's a link between environmental degradation and vulnerability, which calls for a broader understanding of our system as a whole. So given the three dimensions, it's not just three dimensions, how they are all acting together and how they are all working together, you need to have a broad understanding. Again, it's interdisciplinary phenomenon, so you need to invite a lot of different types of expertise together to understand the true vulnerability of that particular city. So yeah, in the last, again, that urban vulnerability, especially in India, is multifaceted and involving socio-economic, environmental, infrastructure, and government sector. When I say multifaceted, basically means that, I mean, like, it's not just one sector is facing that impact. There are different sectors, there are different regions which are facing this impact and the vulnerabilities. So, and again, involving different types of socio-economic strata as well. And to reduce vulnerability, you need the integrated approach by combining maybe policy, technology, or also most important, community-based solutions. So if you have that, you can reduce your vulnerability much more easier. Nowadays, a lot of NGOs are working on that. Nowadays, a lot of even institutions like, for example, us, we are also looking forward like how like these communities are resilient, how these communities we can help them to improve their let's say capacity so that they can reduce their risk, they can reduce their vulnerability part. So yeah, these are the things. I mean, I know we are doing that, and it's globally happening around all over the world. And given now the COP is also happening in the Baku. So over there they also talking about like how we can, in terms of urban areas, how we can reduce the vulnerability. So yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you very much. And if you have any queries or any doubts, you can also reach out to me. And we are now open to discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. It was a very wonderful session. You have shed light on the crucial aspects of the SDG goals and also their relevance in determining the urban vulnerabilities. So thank you very much. The floor is now open for questions. Participants can raise their hands or put their question in the Q&A box. Yes, Lalitji.
Sir, today in the newspaper there was an article around the plantation, the sugar cane workers in Bhide, and there was a report released from America regarding the nature of forced labor going on out in those areas. So, in the context of vulnerability, if we were to talk about those things, because India rejected those reports based on that it was created based on incomplete information. But what I want to understand is Bede or being a tier three, or I would say it's not entirely a urban area, but it's not entirely a rural area either. And ideally, those conditions, those vulnerabilities in those settings are the reasons which lead to rural-urban migration. So, in that context, if we were to assess and propose alternate solutions, or we want to understand exactly that what led to something which is not a present practice. The migration is a normal phenomena. But what the report talked about was the laborers being kept in camps or in conditions which were not in compliance with the labor laws or things like that.
Okay. So see, I have not read the report, so I cannot comment on that part. What I
Okay.
can comment on that is basically regarding migration. We're talking about migration and this is happening over there. So in terms of climate change adaptation, migration is also a part of form of adaptation. So basically, what you're doing is that you're facing some kind of impact. For example, if you're not getting resources, livelihood, over there your vulnerability is higher. So you move to a better place in search of more better opportunity and livelihood. And in a way, it's also a migration. Or sorry, in a way, it's also a type of adaptation. There are two types of adaptation. One is a coping practice, another one is an adaptation. So in coping practice is basically like your sudden reflex. For example, like a sudden change that you do. For example, any impact is happening, and then your first response. That is the coping part. We call them short-term adaptation practices. Adaptation is basically long-term solutions which, in a way, reduce the overall risk of climate change impact. So I think these are the two regarding the migration part. So again, I mean, see, I cannot comment on the report part because I've not gone through it. And again, if you, let's say, for example, even if you want to assess the vulnerability, let's say, of these communities and, given this scenario over there, what you can do, again, because we are saying it's a rural and maybe semi-urban kind of area, right? So in that case, you need to make sure that the kind of indicators you are taking. See, in vulnerability assessment, indicators are very important. And there's also a misconception that if you take more number of indicators, our vulnerability would be better. No, there should be a proper justification. There should be proper rationale why you're taking particular set of indicators. Either you can divide them into three components, as I mentioned in the lecture, that exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and see how this community of, let's say, these bee farmers, they're putting into, what kind of exposure they are getting. Exposure again, all the natural exposure, climatic exposure, or also some form of in terms of sensitivity, what kind of MSP they are getting. Are they getting good prices or not good prices for their harvest, or maybe what kind of, for example, income they have, education they have, and so on. Similarly, and we divide them into the adaptive capacity in the process as well to see whether are they able to sustain these damages or they able to sustain these kind of harms or not. So once we have that data, once we have these indicators, you can then come, to true vulnerability of the farmer. Because again, saying without having proper understanding, a proper idea what this, where this stands, it's also wrong. I cannot make a comment on that whether they are vulnerable or not. I have to see this data first, and then I will be able to comment. That's yeah.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much.
Yes, there's a question in the Q&A box, sir. So it says, as per your research and observation, what are the major unaddressed criteria of master planning for Tier 1 and 2, 3, Tier 2 and 3 cities, due to which cities are facing big physical infrastructural challenges?
Okay, what are the major challenges? Okay, what are the major challenges in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities? Regarding what?
So
Is it the Q&A or
physical
open?
infrastructural challenges.
Your voice is not clear. Somehow it's like echoing.
Sir,
Okay.
am I audible now?
You're audible, but your voice is like echoing or something.
So it's the question is in the Q&A box, sir. It says, as per your research and observation, what are the major unaddressed criteria of master planning for Tier 2 and 3 cities, due to which cities are facing big physical infrastructure challenges?
Okay, so basically you're talking about Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. So see, I want to give you this example, this answer of this question with respect to what is happening in Delhi right now. The major focus right now in Delhi, being a big city, and given the kind of AQI they are having over there, but the focus should also be on the Tier 2, Tier 3 cities around the Delhi, because they are also facing this problem. It's not just one big city, and because nowadays in media also everything is about Delhi and the AQI over there, but they're not talking about the surrounding cities. Even their AQI is also like a terrible scale, like around 400, 500 scale. The problem is that unless until we do something in these cities as well, we are not going to find proper solutions for the city. Now, coming to the infrastructure part, I mean, of course, the planning, in bigger cities, we have a major, like, for example, 5-year plan, 20-year plans, 30-year plans, this kind of thing. So, these plannings they plan accordingly, but they do not consider what, for example, the surrounding nearby Tier 2, 3 cities, there is a connection between them or not. Challenges are again, see, there are common challenges in Tier 2, 3 cities. You can talk about the lack of money, lack of political will. I mean, see, wherever there's money, the people, the challenge, the program will come. They will come. They see that the more money and the more resources are available in the big cities, so they focus more on that. Not many, for example, decision makers, policy makers, they don't do that in the smaller cities. But we should also focus on that, how to improve and connect the to them to the urban services, urban, for example, all the facilities they have. So once we'll do that, only then we'll be able to bridge the gap between the vulnerabilities. Right now, what is happening? Although we say Delhi, Mumbai, bigger cities, they are also vulnerable, but these smaller cities are also becoming vulnerable. Why they are becoming vulnerable? Because again, I think this Lalit gave this example of the Bhide, because a lot of migration is happening from their places. Why this migration is happening? Because these cities again do not have proper resources, they do not have proper opportunities, maybe in terms of education, maybe in terms of healthcare, maybe in terms of livelihood. So they are forced to do that. I mostly work on the Himalayan region throughout my research career. So what I can give you an example, there's a concept called ghost villages in the Himalayan region. So ghost village basically means the entire population of the village has been migrated to maybe nearby cities, to maybe nearby towns for better opportunities. And this is what is also happening in our Tier 2, Tier 3 cities. People are not getting proper services, they are not getting proper, let's say, facilities. So they are, like whenever anyone gets good amount of money, any chance, they are migrating to the bigger cities. And this is also causing a bigger I mean, addition of this inflow of this community, the people, is also causing a higher vulnerability among this, for example, these bigger cities, which are already vulnerable, which are already at higher risk of these climate impacts. And because of this situation, what is happening around the cities, it's not just in India, globally also. Most of the developing countries you see, this is a common phenomenon. Most of the population, because unless until you do or provide the basic services, basic let's say facilities in these regions, population will definitely will inflow to the bigger cities, and in there they are again going to cause. Again, I don't want to use the word cause because it's not their fault that they are causing or adding to the vulnerability, but technically, yeah, they come to these cities, and again, because they do not find proper, let's say, settlements, they live in informal settlements, and again, adds to the overall vulnerability. Yeah.
Are there any further questions?
No, if you have any further questions, you can also reach out to me on my email. I will be happy to answer you all of you. Yeah.
Sure, sir. Yeah, seeing none of questions now, I think. So thank you so much, sir. It was a very wonderful session. We hope to see you in further IMPRI events as well. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Satan. Thank you all. Good luck to you all. I mean, you already a good program, and I hope by the end of it, you will be able to, do this kind of assessment and urban planners. Basically, you'll do something good in future. Good luck to all of you. Thank you, Satan.
Thank you very much.
Should I leave now?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Moving on to the end of the session with the vote of thanks. So we come to the end of day 7 of UPLGYF, Urban Policy and Local Governance Youth Fellowship, an online national autumn and winter school program, a 4-month online immersive introductory leadership certificate training fellowship program. I, Shweta, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, would like to propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI, New Delhi. We are grateful to our experts for the day 7 session, Dr. Praveen Kumar and Professor Amita Bhide ji, for taking out their valuable time and allowing us to learn from this online certificate program. We thank all of our participants who have raised pertinent questions and have actively participated in today's deliberation. We look forward to welcoming you on November 21st for day 8 of this certification course by distinguished experts, Dr. Ravikant Joshi ji and Dr. Ratula Kundu. We are grateful if you are watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our various podcasts or reading our publications. We hope you continue to join in future to our IMPRI Web Policy Talk and Web Policy Learning. Wishing you a very good day. Thank you.